What happens when everything you've built crumbles in a single day? When the voices meant to comfort you become accusations instead? When heaven itself falls silent to your cries? These are not hypothetical questions for the broken and desperate. They are the lived reality of a man who stood at the intersection of divine purpose and cosmic warfare. His name was Job, and his story forces us to confront the most terrifying question humanity has ever faced. Would you still trust God if He gave you nothing but suffering? In the ancient land of Uz, far from the centers of civilization, there existed a man whose righteousness was unmatched. Job was not merely good by human standards. He was blameless in ways that made heaven itself take notice. 7 sons, 3 daughters, thousands of animals stretching across the horizon, servants attending his every need. He was the greatest man in all the East, a title that carried weight in a world where greatness was measured in both wealth and character. But what Job possessed in abundance was about to be tested in ways no human should endure. The scene shifts from earth to heaven, where beings of light gather before the throne of the Almighty. Among them walks another figure, darker in purpose and intent. Satan himself appears before God, not as an outsider, but as one who still has access to the divine counsel. His presence is not coincidental. He has been roaming the earth, watching humanity, searching for cracks in the foundation of faith. And now he stands before God with a challenge that will shake the heavens and devastate one man's life. God speaks first, drawing attention to his servant Job. There is pride in the Creator's voice when he mentions this man who fears him and turns from evil. But Satan hears something different in God's words. He hears an opportunity to prove his cynical view of human devotion. The accuser's response drips with contempt as he suggests that Job's faithfulness is nothing more than a transaction, a business arrangement where blessings are exchanged for worship. Remove the hedge of protection, Satan argues, and watch how quickly devotion turns to cursing. The wager is set, though it is far more than a mere bet between cosmic powers. It is a test of whether human faith can exist without reward, whether love for God can survive when every earthly reason for that love is stripped away. God grants Satan permission to touch everything Job has, with one restriction: the man himself must not be harmed. As the heavenly council dissolves and Satan departs with dark purpose, Job remains unaware below. He has no idea that his name has been spoken in the throne room of eternity, or that his entire world is about to collapse.
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
The sun rose over Uz like any other morning, casting long shadows across Job's vast estates. Servants moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, attending to thousands of animals that represented decades of accumulated wealth. In the distance, Job's children gathered at the eldest son's house for one of their regular celebrations, their laughter carrying on the wind. There was no omen, no dark cloud on the horizon, no warning that this ordinary day would become the worst of Job's life. Evil does not always announce itself with thunder. Job was at home when the first messenger arrived, running so hard his legs barely kept him upright. Sweat and terror covered his face in equal measure as he gasped for breath, struggling to form words around the horror he had witnessed. The Sabians had attacked without warning, falling upon the oxen and donkeys like a plague of locusts. The servants who tried to defend the herds were cut down without mercy, their blood soaking into the earth they had worked. Only this one man escaped, fleeing while the screams of his companions still echoed behind him. Before Job could even process the first tragedy, a second messenger burst through the door with wild eyes and trembling hands. This time it was not human raiders, but something far worse. Fire had fallen from the sky itself, divine fire that consumed everything it touched. The sheep, all 7,000 of them, were burned to ash along with the shepherds who tended them. The messenger's voice cracked as he described the flames, supernatural in their intensity, leaving nothing but charred earth where life had been moments before. He alone survived to bring this impossible news. The third messenger arrived before the second had finished speaking, creating a nightmarish chorus of grief and destruction. The Chaldeans had come in 3 raiding parties, organized and ruthless in their assault on Job's camels. 3,000 animals, gone in minutes, along with every servant assigned to protect them. The pattern was becoming clear but incomprehensible. Job was being systematically destroyed from multiple directions at once, as if the entire world had turned against him in a single morning. Yet the worst was still to come, racing toward his door on the feet of one final bearer of unbearable news. the fourth messenger arrived with death in his eyes, carrying news that would break something in Job that wealth could never repair. Job's children, all 10 of them, had been feasting together when a mighty wind rose from the desert. Not a natural wind, but something else, something with purpose and malice. It struck the four corners of the house simultaneously, collapsing the structure upon everyone inside, sons and daughters, the future of Job's legacy, crushed beneath stone and timber while wine still wet their lips. The messenger's final words hung in the air like a curse. They are all dead. Job stood frozen, his mind unable to comprehend the cascade of horror that had just been delivered to his doorstep. In the span of minutes, everything he had built over a lifetime had been obliterated. His wealth, his security, his legacy, and most devastating of all, his children. 10 souls who had been laughing and alive at sunrise were now corpses waiting to be pulled from rubble. The natural response would be rage, would be cursing, would be demanding answers from a heaven that seemed to have abandoned him. But what Job did next defied every human instinct. He stood slowly, his body moving with deliberate control even as his world spun into chaos around him. Then he reached up and took hold of his robe, the garment that marked his status and dignity, and tore it from neck to hem. The sound of ripping fabric echoed through the room, a physical manifestation of internal devastation. Next, he took a blade and shaved his head, removing the hair that symbolized his vitality and strength. These were the ancient gestures of mourning, the body's way of expressing what words could never capture. Job was performing a funeral for everything he had lost. Then came the moment that would define Job's entire story and echo through millennia. Instead of shaking his fist at heaven, he fell to the ground, not in defeat, but in worship. His face pressed against the earth as tears streamed down his cheeks, and from his broken heart came words that should have been impossible. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. He acknowledged the fundamental truth that everything he possessed had been a gift, borrowed for a season, never truly owned. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, he whispered into the dust. His final words that day were the most shocking of all. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Even in agony, even in incomprehensible loss, Job chose to bless rather than curse. He chose to worship rather than abandon his faith. This was not denial or emotional numbness. Job was fully present in his grief, fully aware of the magnitude of his loss. Yet somehow, beneath the crushing weight of tragedy, his foundation held firm. He did not understand why, but he knew who, and that knowledge was enough to keep him from the abyss of despair. The narrator's voice tells us something crucial. In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. He passed the first test that Satan said he would fail. The accuser had predicted that Job would curse God to his face when blessings were removed. Instead, Job blessed God's name while kneeling in the wreckage of his life. But Satan was not finished, and neither was Job's suffering. The next round would strike even closer to home, attacking the one thing Job still possessed, his own flesh and bones. Time passed, though we are not told how much. Job had buried his children and adjusted to poverty, learning to live with less after knowing abundance. The wounds in his heart were still raw, the absence of his sons and daughters, a constant ache that never dulled. Yet he maintained his integrity, still fearing God and turning from evil even when evil had devastated his life. Then the angels gathered before God again, and once more Satan appeared among them, his mission against Job incomplete and his contempt for human faithfulness unshaken. God initiated the conversation, drawing Satan's attention back to Job with unmistakable satisfaction in his voice. The challenge had been met and surpassed. Job remained blameless and upright, still maintaining his integrity, though Satan had incited God against him to ruin him without reason. The words hung between them heavy with implication. Satan had been wrong about Job, proven wrong by the very test he himself had designed. But the accuser does not admit defeat easily, and he was not willing to concede that genuine faith could exist in humanity. Satan's response revealed the depths of his cynicism about human nature and his understanding of what truly motivates people. "Skin for skin," he said with a voice like grinding stone. "A man will give all he has for his own life." The argument was simple and cruel. Job had lost possessions and even children, but he still had himself. His body was still healthy, still free from pain, still capable of enjoying whatever simple pleasures remained. "Take that away," Satan argued, "and then watch faith crumble into cursing. Strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." God's response was permission with one boundary. "Very well, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." The restriction was important, revealing that this was not about destruction for its own sake, but about testing the limits of human faithfulness. Satan was being allowed to push Job to the absolute edge of endurance without pushing him over into death. Everything short of killing him was now permissible. As Satan departed from the divine presence with this new authority, one can only imagine the dark satisfaction in his movements as he turned his attention earthward once more. What happened next was a descent into physical torment that few humans have ever endured. Satan struck Job with painful sores that erupted across his entire body from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. These were not ordinary wounds, but boils that inflamed and festered, oozing pus and creating constant agony with every breath, every movement, every moment of consciousness. Job's skin became his enemy, a prison of suffering from which there was no escape. The man who had been the greatest in the East was reduced to something barely recognizable as human. Job could no longer remain in his home or among the living. The combination of his appearance and his uncleanness according to the laws of the time forced him to the edges of society. He made his way to the ash heap outside the city, the place where refuse was burned and discarded. There, among the garbage and waste of human civilization, Job sat down in the ashes and took a broken piece of pottery in his trembling hands. With this crude tool, he scraped at his sores, trying to find even a moment's relief from the constant burning that covered every inch of his flesh. His wife found him there, sitting in refuse like a piece of broken humanity thrown away by God and man alike. She had lost everything too: her children, her wealth, her social standing, and now even the dignity of her husband. Whatever faith she once had could not survive watching the man she loved reduced to this pitiful state. Her words cut through the air with bitter desperation. "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." It was not hatred in her voice, but a twisted form of mercy, a plea for him to end this torture by provoking God to finish what he had started. Job looked at his wife through eyes dimmed by pain and saw not an enemy, but another victim of this incomprehensible suffering. His response was gentle but firm, refusing the escape she offered, even though part of him must have been tempted by it. "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks," he said, not calling her foolish, but noting that her words came from a place of foolishness, from emotions that had overwhelmed wisdom. Then he asked the question that would frame his entire ordeal: shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Even now, even in this, Job did not sin with his lips. Word of Job's calamity spread across the region until it reached the ears of 3 men who knew him well: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite heard what had happened and made arrangements to travel to their friend. Their intentions were pure at the outset. They came to mourn with Job and to comfort him in his suffering. These were not strangers or casual acquaintances, but close friends who had known Job in his prosperity and could not bear the thought of him suffering alone. They left their homes and journeyed to Uz with heavy hearts and good intentions. When they arrived and saw Job from a distance, they did not recognize him. The man sitting in ashes, covered in sores and scraping himself with broken pottery, bore no resemblance to the prosperous and dignified friend they remembered. The shock of recognition when it came was so profound that they raised their voices and wept aloud, tearing their robes and throwing dust on their heads in traditional gestures of mourning. Then they did something remarkable. They sat down on the ground with Job and remained there for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking a single word. They saw that his grief was too great for words, and in that moment, their silent presence was the greatest comfort they could offer. After 7 days of silence, something inside Job finally broke. The dam of restraint that had held back the full force of his anguish could no longer contain the flood of despair that rose within him. He opened his mouth, and what emerged was not a curse against God as Satan had predicted, but something perhaps more disturbing: a curse against his own existence. Job wished he had never been born, that the day of his conception had been erased from time itself. "Let the day perish on which I was born," he cried, "and the night that said a man is conceived." His words painted a picture of cosmic reversal, imagining a world where the moment of his existence had been swallowed by darkness before it could manifest. He wanted that day struck from the calendar, cursed by those who curse days. shrouded in eternal night without even starlight to mark its passing. The poetic intensity of his lament revealed the depth of his psychological torment. Physical pain had broken through to existential despair. Job was not just suffering in his body, but questioning the very purpose of his life, wondering why God allows people to be born if this is what awaits them. "Why did I not perish at birth?" he demanded of the silence, "or die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me, and breasts that I might be nursed?" Job imagined the peace of death, the rest that comes to those who never draw breath, or whose first breath is also their last. He spoke of death as a great equalizer, where kings and counselors rest alongside slaves, where the wicked cease from turmoil and the weary find rest. In his mind, non-existence had become preferable to existence, and death more merciful than life. His questions grew more pointed and personal as he continued. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Why does God give life to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? The irony of that last phrase was profound. Earlier, Satan had accused God of putting a hedge of protection around Job. Now Job himself felt hedged in, but not by protection, by suffering. The same divine attention that once blessed him now seemed to trap him in torment with no escape and no explanation. Job's speech revealed something crucial about the nature of his struggle. He was not primarily angry at God for taking away his children or his wealth. Those losses, though devastating, he had accepted with worship. But this prolonged physical agony combined with the silence of heaven, this was breaking him in ways that sudden tragedy had not. He was experiencing what many sufferers know, that sometimes the hardest part is not the catastrophe itself, but the grinding daily reality of living with its aftermath when no relief comes and no answers are given. Eliphaz the Temanite could remain silent no longer. 7 days of watching Job curse his birth had convinced him that his friend needed correction, not just comfort. He began carefully, almost apologetically, asking if Job would be offended if he spoke. But his diplomacy was thin covering for the accusation beneath. "If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient?" he asked, then proceeded without waiting for an answer. His central thesis was simple and brutal. The innocent do not suffer like this, therefore Job must not be innocent. Eliphaz spoke from the worldview that dominated ancient Near Eastern thought and still haunts religious communities today, the doctrine of retribution. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and the severity of suffering directly correlates to the severity of sin. He dressed up his accusation in spiritual language, claiming to have received his wisdom through a mysterious nighttime vision. "Consider now," he said with the confidence of one who believes he speaks for God, "who that was innocent ever perished?" According to Eliphaz, Job's suffering was proof of hidden sin, and his only path forward was confession and repentance. Job's response exploded with pain and frustration. "If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales," he cried, "it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas." His friend's words seemed tasteless to him, like food without salt, offering nothing of substance to address his actual condition. He admitted that his words had been rash, but argued that the words of a desperate man should not be judged by normal standards. "The arrows of the Almighty are in me," he declared. "My spirit drinks in their poison." He was not suffering from natural causes, but from something that felt like divine assault. The conversation devolved into something darker as Job continued. He challenged his friends to show him where he had sinned, what he had done to deserve this catastrophe. "I know my heart," he insisted, "and God knows it too. Even if he crushes me for no reason, I will maintain that I am innocent." The shift was significant. Job was no longer just lamenting his condition, but actively defending himself against accusations of secret sin. The friends who had come to comfort had become prosecutors, and Job found himself on trial without knowing the charges. Bildad the Shuhite spoke next, unable to contain his rising anger at what he perceived as Job's pride and stubbornness. "How long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind." His theology was even more rigid than Eliphaz's, leaving no room for mystery or unexplained suffering. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? Then came the cruelest blow of all. If your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Bildad was suggesting that Job's children deserved to die, that their deaths were divine punishment for their wickedness. Job's response to Bildad revealed a man pushed beyond the breaking point of diplomatic speech. "Indeed, I know that this is true," he said with bitter sarcasm. "But how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God?" He acknowledged God's power and wisdom, describing divine might in language that mixed awe with accusation. God moves mountains without their knowing it, commands the sun and it does not shine, speaks to the earth and it trembles. But this power, Job argued, was being used against him without cause or explanation, and he had no way to defend himself. The legal imagery in Job's speech intensified as he imagined standing before God in court. "Even if I summoned him and he responded, I do not believe he would give me a hearing. He would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason." Job felt caught in a cosmic injustice where the judge, prosecutor, and executioner were the same being, and that being had unlimited power to do as he pleased. If it is a matter of strength, he is mighty. If it is a matter of justice, who can challenge him? The deck was stacked, the game rigged, and Job saw no path to vindication. Yet beneath the complaints and accusations, something else was emerging in Job's speeches. Even as he questioned God's justice, he could not stop addressing God directly. "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him," he declared in a moment of startling faith breaking through despair. "I will surely defend my ways to his face." Job wanted an audience with the Almighty, wanted to make his case directly rather than through these friends who understood nothing. It was a strange mixture of defiance and devotion, of anger and trust existing simultaneously in the same tortured heart. Zophar the Naamathite was the last of the three friends to speak, and his patience was exhausted. Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? His contempt for Job's claims of innocence was barely concealed beneath religious rhetoric. "Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom." Zophar was certain that if God did speak, he would reveal Job's hidden sins and show that he was actually getting less punishment than he deserved. "Know this," he concluded with supreme arrogance, "God has even forgotten some of your sin." The three friends had now all spoken, and their message was unified in its cruelty. Job was suffering because Job was sinful, and his refusal to confess was making everything worse. They could not conceive of a world where a righteous man suffers unjustly, where the equations of cosmic justice do not balance neatly, where God's ways are genuinely mysterious rather than merely hidden from the wicked. Their theology was ironclad and merciless, leaving no room for the messy reality of undeserved suffering. And in their certainty, they had become Job's tormentors rather than his comforters, adding psychological and spiritual agony to his physical pain. The debate continued through multiple rounds, each friend taking turns trying to convince Job of his guilt, while Job maintained his innocence with increasing desperation. The ash heap had become a courtroom where theology clashed with lived experience, where systematic belief confronted the chaos of actual suffering. Job's friends represented the voice of conventional religion, speaking truths that were accurate in general, but murderously false in this particular case. They were right that sin leads to suffering, but catastrophically wrong in assuming that all suffering must therefore come from sin. Job felt the isolation closing in around him like walls shrinking in the darkness. "My relatives have gone away," he lamented. "My closest friends have forgotten me. Even young children despise me. When I appear, they ridicule me. All my intimate friends detest me. Those I love have turned against me." The social death that accompanied his physical affliction was perhaps more painful than the boils covering his skin. Humans are made for community, for connection, for the solidarity of shared existence. To be abandoned in suffering is to experience a preview of hell itself. His descriptions of his physical condition grew more graphic as the speeches progressed, as if he needed his friends to truly see what they were judging so confidently from their distance. "I am nothing but skin and bones," he told them. "I have escaped only by the skin of my teeth. My breath is offensive to my wife, and I am loathsome to my own family." He was rotting alive, watching his body decay, while his mind remained sharp enough to feel every moment of the horror. Death would have been mercy, but death did not come. Throughout his speeches, Job kept returning to a single desperate wish. If only he could present his case directly to God. He knew that his friends were useless, convinced of their own correctness and deaf to his actual experience. But God, surely God would listen, would explain, would at least acknowledge that this suffering was not proportionate to any sin Job might have committed. "If only there were someone to mediate between us," Job cried. "Someone to bring us together. Someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more." He was groping toward an idea that would not be fully realized until centuries later. The tragedy of these exchanges was that both sides thought they were defending God's honor. The friends believed that by insisting on Job's guilt, they were protecting divine justice from the implications of innocent suffering. Job believed that by maintaining his innocence, he was refusing to bear false witness and slander himself to make God look good. Neither side could see the larger picture, the cosmic drama playing out beyond the ash heap, the question that Satan had raised and that Job's faithfulness was answering. They were all fighting in the dark, unaware of the true nature of the battle. As the cycles of speech continued, Job's theology began to evolve under the pressure of his suffering. He started to make a distinction between God as he appears in power and God as he might be in essence. The God he was experiencing seemed capricious and cruel, striking the innocent and guilty alike without discrimination. Yet somewhere in Job's battered faith remained the conviction that this could not be the whole truth, that there must be more to the divine nature than what his suffering suggested. It was this tension that drove him to his most profound insight. "I know that my Redeemer lives," Job suddenly declared, "and that in the end he will stand on the earth." The Hebrew word translated as Redeemer is Goel, a family member who buys back property or avenges wrongs done to relatives. Job was claiming that despite everything, despite the appearance that God himself was his enemy, there existed someone who would stand up for him, who would vindicate him, who would prove his innocence. "And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God." This was not just hope for eventual vindication, but confidence in resurrection itself. The passage is one of the most mysterious and disputed in all of Scripture, but its emotional force is undeniable. Job was staking his entire being on the belief that death would not be the end, that beyond the grave he would stand in his body and see God with his own eyes, not as an enemy, but as a vindicator. "I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." It was a stunning act of faith from a man who had every reason to abandon faith entirely. Somehow, suffering had driven Job not away from God, but toward a deeper understanding of who God must be. This cry for a mediator, for a goal who stands between humanity and divinity, echoes forward through time toward the New Testament revelation of Jesus Christ. Job could not have known the full meaning of what he was saying, could not have imagined the cross where God himself would become the mediator, where justice and mercy would meet in blood and resurrection. But he grasped at the edges of a truth that his friends with all their confident theology had completely missed, that God's ways are not simply mysterious but paradoxical, that sometimes the path to vindication runs through death itself. The friends had no response to this. They continued their accusations, but with less conviction now, repeating themselves and growing shriller in their condemnations. Job had moved beyond their understanding into territory their systematic theology could not map. He was no longer just defending his innocence, but articulating a faith that could survive even if God killed him, a trust that looked beyond death for answers that life refused to provide. It was faith refined by fire until all that remained was the unshakable core. God is just, I am innocent, and somehow these two truths will be reconciled even if I cannot see how. The ash heap had become a place of theological revolution, where old certainties were dying and new understandings struggling to be born. Job did not have all the answers. He admitted repeatedly that he did not understand what was happening to him. But he had found something more valuable than answers. He had found a faith that did not depend on understanding, a trust that did not require explanation, a hope that could look into the face of death and still believe in resurrection. And this, though he did not know it, was the answer to Satan's challenge, the proof that human faith could exist without the bribe of blessing. Then, after all the words had been spoken and exhausted, after Job's speeches and his friends' accusations had circled back on themselves multiple times, something changed in the atmosphere. The sky darkened not with natural clouds, but with a presence that made the air itself feel heavy. A wind began to rise, but not from any earthly direction. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, swirling into a whirlwind that roared with a voice beyond weather. And from that storm, From that terrible and beautiful manifestation of raw divine presence, God himself spoke. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? The question cut through all of Job's speeches, all his accusations and complaints, with surgical precision. God was not interested in defending himself or explaining his actions. Instead, he challenged Job's fundamental assumption that as a human being, Job had the standing or knowledge to question the governance of the universe. "Brace yourself like a man," God commanded. "I will question you, and you will answer me." The tables had turned. Job had wanted his day in court. Now he was getting it, but not in the way he expected. The questions that followed were not answers, but something more powerful, a revelation of perspective. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? On what were its footings set? God took Job on a tour of creation, from the foundations of the earth to the storehouses of snow, from the dawn to the depths of the sea. Each question was designed not to humiliate Job, but to recalibrate his understanding of his place in the cosmos. The universe was vast beyond imagining, complex beyond comprehension, and it had been running according to divine wisdom long before Job's birth. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? The astronomical questions revealed the scope of divine governance extending to the very structure of the heavens. Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you and say, "Here we are"? The natural world operated on principles Job did not understand, following laws he did not write, sustained by power he did not possess. And yet, God implied, "You think you understand enough to question my justice?" The animal kingdom came next in God's catalog of wonders. Do you give the horse its strength or clothe its neck with a flowing mane? Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command? Each creature lived according to instincts and abilities that Job had not designed and could not replicate. The wild ox would not submit to Job's harness. The ostrich did not fear him. The warhorse laughed at danger with courage Job had not instilled. Even in the animal world, there were powers and purposes beyond human control or full understanding. Then God spoke of Behemoth and Leviathan, creatures of such might that no human could tame them. "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope?" These beasts, whether literal animals or symbolic representations of chaos itself, were under God's governance, but beyond human mastery. The message was clear. If Job could not contend with these creatures that God had made, how could he contend with their creator? If the creation exceeded his power, how much more the source of all power? Job's response to this overwhelming revelation came in stages, the first of which was simply to fall silent. After all his speeches, all his arguments and complaints, all his questions and accusations, he suddenly had nothing left to say. "I am unworthy," he whispered. "How can I reply to you?" I put my hand over my mouth. It was not the silence of defeat, but of recognition, the moment when someone realizes they have been speaking confidently about matters far beyond their comprehension. Job had not been entirely wrong in what he said, but he had been wrong about his ability to judge God's actions from his limited human perspective. The hand over the mouth was a gesture of humility, but also of wisdom. Job recognized that continuing to speak from his position of ignorance would only compound his errors. "I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." He had exhausted human wisdom and found it inadequate to the mystery of divine governance. This was not God forcing Job into submission through superior power, but Job voluntarily acknowledging that power alone does not explain what was happening. God was not just stronger than Job. God knew things and saw things that Job could not know or see. Yet the silence was not complete. God spoke again from the whirlwind, still questioning, still revealing the scope of creation that Job had never considered. The second round of questions focused even more on the unbridgeable gap between creator and creature. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? God was making explicit what had been implied in Job's speeches, that in maintaining his innocence, Job had essentially put God on trial, requiring God to explain himself or be found unjust. The logic was understandable, but fundamentally backwards. Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? The questions were not cruel, but clarifying. Job wanted to understand the principles by which the universe is governed, but he lacked the capacity to govern a single sparrow's fall, let alone the rising and setting of stars. How then could he possibly evaluate whether God's governance was just? Justice at a cosmic scale might look very different from justice at a human scale, operating on timelines and considering factors that mortal minds cannot encompass. Job was being asked to trust what he could not understand. The revelation from the whirlwind did not answer Job's questions about why he had suffered. God never explained the conversation with Satan, never justified the deaths of Job's children, never provided a reason for the boils and the ash heap and the abandonment. But God did something more important. He revealed himself. He showed up. The problem had never been that God was absent, but that God was silent. Now God spoke, and in speaking demonstrated that Job had never been forgotten, never been abandoned, never been outside the awareness of the one who governs all things. The silence had not been indifference, but a terrible and purposeful waiting. Job's second response went deeper than his first silence. Something had shifted inside him during God's revelation, some fundamental recalibration of his understanding of reality and his place within it. "I know that you can do all things," he said. "No purpose of yours can be thwarted." It was an acknowledgement of divine sovereignty, but not the grudging admission of someone who has been beaten into submission. Rather, it was the recognition of someone who has seen something true and can no longer unsee it. Then, Job quoted God's own words back to him. "You asked, 'Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge?'" By repeating the question, Job was owning it, accepting that it applied to him. "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand," he continued, "things too wonderful for me to know." He had been talking about the governance of the universe, about justice and suffering and divine purpose, as if he had the knowledge and standing to evaluate these matters. Now he saw the profound presumption in this, the way finite minds inevitably distort infinite realities when they try to contain them. The next admission was even more significant. "You said, 'Listen now and I will speak. I will question you and you will answer me.'" Job acknowledged that he had wanted God to answer his questions, to explain himself, to justify his actions. But God had turned the tables, and in doing so, had revealed the proper order of things. It is not God who must answer to humanity, but humanity that must respond to God. The courtroom Job had imagined, with himself as prosecutor and God as defendant, was revealed as an absurd inversion of reality. Then came the statement that has echoed through centuries of theological reflection: "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job had known about God intellectually, theologically, through tradition and teaching and secondhand reports. But the whirlwind had brought direct encounter, immediate experience, the overwhelming reality of the divine presence itself. And that encounter had changed everything. Intellectual knowledge of God, no matter how accurate, is fundamentally different from experiential knowledge of God. Job had moved from the first to the second, and there was no going back. "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." The final statement is often misunderstood as complete self-condemnation, but the Hebrew is more nuanced. Job was not saying he hated himself, but that he rejected his former way of thinking, his former perspective that put himself at the center of evaluation. The dust and ashes, which had been the location of his suffering, now became the place of his transformation. He remained in the same physical circumstances, still in pain, still bereaved, still impoverished, but something had changed at the level of understanding. He had met God, and the meeting had remade him from the inside out, even as his outside remained broken. After Job had spoken, after his repentance and recalibration, God turned his attention to the three friends who had sat in such confident judgment throughout the entire ordeal. His words to them were not gentle. "I am angry with you and your two friends," God said to Eliphaz, "because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." The statement must have landed like a thunderbolt on men who were certain they had been defending God's honor with their accusations. Everything they had said about retribution theology, about suffering as proof of sin, about Job's need to confess, it was all wrong. The irony was profound and unsettling. Job, who had questioned God's justice and demanded an explanation, who had wished he had never been born and accused God of treating him as an enemy, Job had spoken the truth about God. The friends who had defended divine justice and insisted on the perfection of God's governance and refused to admit any mystery or ambiguity, they had spoken falsely. What the friends got wrong was not their theology in abstract, but their application of it to Job's specific case. They had sacrificed truth on the altar of systematic consistency, choosing their theological constructs over the lived reality of their suffering friend. God's remedy was as unexpected as his rebuke. He commanded the three friends to offer burnt offerings for themselves, 7 bulls and 7 rams, a significant sacrifice suggesting the seriousness of their error, but the offerings alone would not be sufficient. "And my servant Job will pray for you," God continued, "and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly." The man they had accused, the friend they had judged and condemned, would now stand as their mediator before God. The one they had pushed to curse God would instead intercede for their forgiveness. The friends complied, bringing their animals and offerings to Job, standing before the man they had wronged and asking him to pray on their behalf. One can only imagine the complexity of emotions in that moment. Job, still sitting among ashes, still covered in sores, still bereaved of his children, being asked to intercede for the men who had added psychological torture to his physical suffering. It would have been understandable if he refused, if he held their cruelty against them, if he demanded acknowledgement of their errors before offering any prayers for their benefit. But Job prayed for his friends. Despite everything, despite the pain they had caused with their false accusations and theological arrogance, he stood in the gap between them and God's anger. In doing so, he prefigured another mediator who would come later, one who would pray for those who crucified him, who would intercede for the very ones who wronged him. Job's willingness to pray for his friends was perhaps the final test of his character, the ultimate proof that his faith was not transactional, that he could bless even those who had cursed him. And when Job prayed for his friends, God accepted his prayer and turned away his anger from them. After Job prayed for his friends, after he had interceded for those who had wronged him, God restored his fortunes. The Hebrew phrase suggests more than just a return to previous conditions. It indicates a complete reversal, a turning of captivity into freedom. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part, the narrator tells us. This was not merely compensation for suffering, but multiplication beyond what had been lost. 14,000 sheep where there had been 7,000, 6,000 camels instead of 3,000, 1,000 yoke of oxen instead of 500, 1,000 donkeys instead of 500. The doubling of his possessions was obvious and measurable, a tangible demonstration that God had not abandoned Job and that the season of testing had ended. But there was something that did not double: his children. God gave Job 7 more sons and 3 daughters, the same number he had lost. Some interpreters suggest this is because, in God's accounting, Job still had his first 10 children. Death had not destroyed them, but only separated them temporarily. The same number was given because the first were not replaced but awaited reunion beyond the grave, a hint toward the resurrection Job had earlier proclaimed. The text makes a point of mentioning Job's daughters by name and noting their extraordinary beauty: Jemimah, Keziah, and Karen Hapuch. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters. But more significantly, Job gave them an inheritance along with their brothers, a radical departure from patriarchal norms, where inheritance typically passed only to sons. The suffering had changed Job not just in his theology, but in his practice, making him more generous, more aware of justice, more willing to break with tradition to honor those who had been marginalized. Pain had made him not bitter, but better. Job lived 140 years after his restoration, seeing his children and their children to the 4th generation. The number is significant, suggesting fullness and completion, double the traditional lifespan of 70 years. He had time to watch his family grow and multiply, to rebuild not just wealth but relationships, to pass on to his descendants the wisdom that had been forged in suffering. The man who had wished he had never been born now lived longer than almost anyone in the narratives, as if God was giving him extra time to compensate for the years the locusts had eaten. And so he died, old and full of years. The final verse is simple but profound in its contentment. Job did not die in bitterness or unresolved anger. He did not spend his final decades demanding further explanations or nursing grudges against God for the suffering that had defined the middle of his life. He died full, satisfied, having lived long enough to see that the story did not end in ashes, that restoration was possible, that God's purposes were larger than any individual season of pain. The ash heap was not his final destination, but a dark valley he passed through on the way to something more. Job's story does not end with Job. His experience becomes a lens through which to understand the larger spiritual warfare that continues throughout human history. Satan's role in the narrative was not incidental, but essential to the larger question being explored. Why do humans worship God? Is faith genuine if it only exists because of blessing? Can devotion survive when all earthly reasons for devotion are stripped away? Job's suffering was not divine sadism, but a cosmic test with implications far beyond one man's life. His faithfulness proved something crucial about the nature of human faith itself. Satan appears in Scripture with several titles, but one of the most significant is the accuser of the brethren. This was his function in Job's story, accusing Job before God of having insincere, mercenary faith. And the text suggests this is still his function in the present age. He continues to accuse believers before God, pointing to their sins and failures, arguing that they do not deserve divine mercy or protection. He twists their motives, questions their devotion, and insists that human faith is always ultimately selfish. He is the prosecuting attorney in the cosmic courtroom, building cases against every person who claims to follow God. But Job's story also points forward to a different kind of advocate. Job had cried out for a mediator, someone who could stand between him and God, someone who could translate his humanity to divine holiness and divine holiness to his humanity. He could not have known how literally that prayer would be answered. Centuries after Job, another man would face accusations, would suffer innocently, would cry out to God in agony. But this man would not be a witness to faith's possibility. He would be faith's foundation, the one through whom all human faithfulness becomes possible. Jesus Christ is called our advocate, our defender in the heavenly courtroom where Satan still brings his accusations. When the accuser points to our sins and argues we should be condemned, Jesus points to his cross and argues we have already been judged, and the judgment fell on him. When Satan says we have failed, Jesus says he has succeeded on our behalf. When the accuser demands justice, Jesus provides it through his death and resurrection. The dynamics of the Job story find their resolution in the gospel. Satan wanted to prove human faith was false, but Jesus makes human faith possible by becoming both the object and the source of that faith. The connection matters because it transforms how we understand our own suffering. Like Job, we often do not know why we suffer. Like Job, we may feel abandoned by God even when we have been faithful. Like Job, we may have friends who offer false comfort or accusatory theology when what we need is presence and prayer. But unlike Job, we have the completed revelation of Jesus Christ, who entered into human suffering not as a test, but as solidarity. We know that God is not distant from our pain, but has experienced it himself in the incarnation, crucifixion, and the cry of dereliction from the cross. Being faithful to God does not guarantee an easy life. Job learned this, and every honest believer since has confirmed it. We will face pain, loss, betrayal, physical suffering, and psychological torment. We will have moments where God seems silent, where prayers feel like they bounce off the ceiling, where the old certainties crumble and we are left groping in darkness. But Job's story tells us that this does not mean God has abandoned us. The silence is not absence, the testing is not punishment, and the story does not end in ashes, even when we cannot yet see how restoration might be possible. God's ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts higher than our thoughts. We will not always understand why things happen as they do. We will not always see the larger pattern or comprehend the cosmic purposes being worked out through our individual lives. And that is okay. We are not required to understand everything, only to trust the one who does. Faith is not certainty about outcomes, but confidence in God's character. It is choosing to believe that God is good even when life is not, that he is trustworthy even when circumstances are chaotic, that he has purposes even when we cannot discern them. When we hurt, it is not only acceptable but necessary to cry, to ask questions, to feel confused and even angry. Job did all these things and was commended for speaking truth about God. What we must not do is let suffering drive us away from God or convince us that he has turned against us. The cross demonstrates definitively that God is for us, that he has entered into our suffering rather than remaining distant from it. And the resurrection promises that death and loss do not have the final word, that restoration is coming even if we do not live to see its fullness in this age. May Job's journey through suffering to restoration remind every person who reads or hears his story, you are never alone in your pain. God sees, God knows, and God cares even when circumstances suggest otherwise. The accuser still brings his charges, but we have an advocate who answers them with his own blood. The suffering is real, but it is not meaningless. And the story, both Job's and ours, does not end in ashes. There is restoration coming, either in this life or the next, when God will wipe away every tear and make all things new. Until that day, we trust not because we understand, but because we have met the one who does, and we know that his love is greater than any storm we face.